The summer heat of 1462 pressed heavy over the plains of Wallachia, turning the air into a suffocating furnace that seemed to carry not just warmth but rot. Clouds of flies rose like smoke, their black wings humming over a grotesque forest of bodies. 20,000 corpses, skewered on wooden stakes, surrounded the stronghold of Targoviste in rings that stretched beyond the horizon. To call them corpses was misleading. Some were still alive, impaled in such a way that breath lingered, their moans weaving into a ghastly choir that echoed across the land. Ottoman soldiers, hardened veterans who had watched Constantinople fall, men who had cut their way through fire and famine, reeled back in horror. Many vomited before they even saw the full scope, the stench alone overwhelming their iron stomachs. The sun had accelerated decay, swelling faces until they burst, skin splitting into rivers of pus. And yet there was order here. This was not chaos, not the random slaughter of a battlefield. It was art. At the center of this nightmare sat Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, a man who had dragged the Byzantine Empire into its grave and crowned himself master of 2 continents. His horse snorted, stamping nervously, the animal's instincts recognizing death's domain. Mehmed pulled hard on the reins, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the tableau. His face, the face that had stared down emperors and generals alike, drained of color. For what confronted him was not merely horror, it was a message. Each stake had been measured, each body raised to the same height. The rings formed concentric circles, precise as a mathematician's diagram, and then he saw it words, spelled in Arabic, carved not into stone but into the placement of corpses, words only someone who had once lived inside the Ottoman palace could have known. They weren't words meant for the army, they were meant for him. The Sultan's hand trembled on the reins. This was no barbarian improvisation, no wild cruelty born of madness. This was deliberate, calculated, methodical, the work of a mind sharpened by pain into something far worse than chaos order. Behind him, his generals muttered prayers, their voices thin with fear. They had seen slaughter, they had seen rebels flayed and captives enslaved, but nothing like this. The geometry of the dead mirrored the geometry of their own ceremonies in Constantinople, the carefully arranged courts, the displays of power that had once impressed noble hostages. Only now the hostages were Ottomans, their bodies spelling out a vengeance none of them dared name aloud. Mehmed knew exactly who had done this, and, more terrifyingly, he knew why. The forest of stakes whispered its accusation. I remember. I learned, I perfected, and for Mehmed. Recognition dawned like a wound reopening. This wasn't just terror, this was autobiography. Every stake an echo of a childhood inside his palace. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you love uncovering the hidden truths of history, please hit the like button and subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we can explore ancient stories together from across the world, connected through time and space by a shared curiosity for the past. Thank you for being here. To understand how the boy became the stake, how Vlad Dracula, Prince of Wallachia, transformed into humanity's most methodical torturer, we must follow him back to that palace, to the marble corridors where footsteps decided fates, and to the perfumed rooms where power taught its most secret lessons. Because the forest of stakes was not born here, on the battlefield. It was born in silence, when an 11-year-old child learned that the only way to survive was to become something worse than his tormentors ever imagined. The marble corridors of Edirne Palace were cold, gleaming, and endless. Each step of the Ottoman guard seemed to echo like a drumbeat, announcing power with every strike of their boots. For most who entered these halls, the sound was meant to inspire awe. For 11-year-old Vlad, it became the rhythm of dread. It was 1442, the year his father, Vlad II, Dracul, bowed to Ottoman demands and handed over his sons as hostages. The Sultan's envoys called them guests. The silk clothes, the golden plates, the ornate chambers, they all suggested privilege. Yet Vlad and his 9-year-old brother Radu knew the truth. They were pawns, collateral to ensure their father's loyalty. The moment the palace doors closed behind them, they were no longer children of a prince, they were bargaining chips in a game older than either of them could comprehend. By day, the training was rigorous but structured, Turkish and Arabic lessons in the morning, theology and court etiquette after midday. Then sword drills until sweat soaked their fine clothes. On the surface, it seemed an education fit for princes. The Ottomans wanted their hostages cultivated, refined, molded into future allies who might one day rule Christian lands in service to Islam. But as the sun slid beneath the horizon, a different education began, one that never appeared in the palace records. The footsteps came for Vlad with cruel regularity. At first, he resisted. He bit and clawed like a wild animal, scratching the faces of men who were twice his size. His small body thrashed in their iron grip, but the struggle always ended the same way: his wrists bound. His feet dragged across polished marble toward the perfumed chambers where music played softly, drowning out other sounds. Radu's laughter echoed down another corridor, genuine laughter. Not forced, even at 9. He had understood what Vlad refused to accept. Survival meant yielding. The guards adored Radu for his compliance, his quick smile, his delicate beauty that drew approving glances. Where Vlad saw humiliation, Radu saw protection. He slipped into silk like a second skin. Vlad did not. His mind bent differently. Each humiliation pressed him harder against an invisible wall, but instead of collapsing, he began to study. He watched the rhythm of the guards' routines, noted the timing of lessons, memorized the faces of those who watched. Even as his body was violated, his mind cataloged the mechanics of power. He noticed how pain always arrived dressed as honor, how submission was disguised as privilege, how the same words could mean safety one hour and degradation the next. This is where his first survival strategy was born, not through surrender like Radu, but through withdrawal. Vlad discovered that he could leave his body. He would float above, detaching his mind from sensation, watching the boy below as if he were a stranger. He called this his armor, though no one else could see it, and behind that armor, hatred fermented. For 6 years, the brothers lived this divided existence. At meals, they sat side by side, smiling with polished etiquette, repeating lessons in perfect Turkish. At night, their paths split. Radu toward the embrace of favor, Vlad into the teeth of defiance. They whispered to each other less and less, their shared Romanian prayers fading into silence. The palace had achieved what it intended. It had turned brothers into rivals. Yet the Ottomans underestimated what they were creating in Vlad. They thought they were grinding him into obedience, reshaping him into a pliable tool. What they did not see was that every night etched itself into his memory like fire into wood. He was memorizing the methods not to forget them but to use them, someday, somewhere. Already his eyes had begun to change, once bright with the impatience of childhood. They now held a sharpness beyond his years, a glint of something the tutors mistook for intelligence but which was, in truth, rage finding its shape. And so, within those glittering halls where princes were supposedly groomed for greatness, the boy who would become Vlad the Impaler took his first lessons in cruelty, not as master but as victim. The nights in Edirne Palace all began the same way: the click of a door, the smell of oil lamps burning too sweetly, and the sound of a lute playing just beyond the threshold. For most boys, music was joy. For Vlad, it was the warning bell that his torment was about to begin. He learned to hate those melodies, the way they smothered screams, the way they never stopped, even when the world inside him was breaking apart. At 11, he discovered a rule no tutor had ever spoken aloud to survive. You must leave yourself behind. While his body remained in that perfumed chamber, Vlad's mind climbed upward, higher and higher, until it floated above the marble floors. From that height, he would look down at the boy below as if he were a stranger, a creature to be studied, not pitied. He trained himself to observe rather than feel. Each violation became an experiment, each humiliation, a lesson. The Ottomans thought they were teaching him submission, but what they were truly doing was sharpening his ability to analyze power in its rawest form. He noted how the guards moved in pairs, how they never struck without ritual, how pain could be delayed, drawn out, disguised as affection. He saw that power was never chaotic, it was calculated, a series of steps repeated until the victim broke. This became the arithmetic he would carry with him for life. Radu, in the next chamber, laughed again. Not the laughter of mockery, but the laughter of survival. Even at 9, he had mastered another rule bend, and you will not break. The younger brother melted into the warmth of the Sultan's court, adorning himself in silks, learning how to charm instead of resist. Vlad watched this with a mixture of contempt and envy. Radu seemed protected, chosen, loved. Vlad felt discarded, brutalized, forgotten. The palace had given each brother a different mask, and they wore them until those masks became flesh. But Vlad's dissociation came with a price. Each night he climbed out of himself. He left something behind. He could not pray as he once had. He could not dream without nightmares. He could no longer feel kindness without suspicion. The boy who had once whispered Romanian prayers with his brother before sleep now clenched his fists against the marble walls, promising that one day those footsteps would echo for him, not against him. The first rule of survival was simple. You could endure anything if you went somewhere else in your mind. But as Vlad practiced that escape, night after night, something twisted inside him. Endurance was no longer enough. Detachment was no longer enough. He needed control. He needed to reverse the equation. In the dark silence after the music faded, young Vlad lay awake and whispered a vow into the shadows one day. I will make them feel what I feel now. Every pattern, every ritual, every method they use on me, I will return it to them, perfected. It was the first seed of a promise that would bloom decades later into forests of stakes, a promise that began not with cruelty but with survival. The palace had a way of noticing differences, where Vlad was sharp angles and burning eyes. His younger brother Radu was softness incarnate. Chroniclers would later write of him as if he were touched by heaven's skin pale as ivory, hair falling like silk, lips curved with an almost feminine grace. In another life, these would have been compliments. In the Ottoman court, they were currency. The brothers had arrived together, terrified and clutching each other's hands in the first weeks. They whispered in Romanian before sleep, reminding themselves of home, of forests and rivers, of their mother's voice, but the system that held them was designed to divide as much as it was to conquer. Soon, the palace handlers recognized the divergence between them and pulled the brothers onto opposite paths. Vlad was the wild horse resistant, snarling, dangerous. He was beaten, restrained, broken down again and again, his punishments escalating as his defiance hardened. Each scar carved into his body only made him more silent, more calculating. Radu, on the other hand, was the songbird. His laughter came easily, his smile even easier when he yielded. Rewards followed gifts of silk robes, jeweled daggers, compliments whispered by tutors and courtiers. He learned quickly that submission was not just survival, it could be power. By reflecting back whatever his captors wanted to see, he became indispensable. The contrast grew starker each year. Vlad's eyes, once restless, now carried the stare of someone who had learned to endure by leaving himself behind. Radu's eyes sparkled with a kind of practiced charm, one that disarmed even the hardest soldiers. To the Ottomans, it was clear one brother must be subdued, the other cultivated. By the time Radu was 11, his beauty had already caught the attention of someone far more dangerous, Prince Mehmed, the future sultan. The young heir was only a few years older, but in the palace hierarchy, the difference was immeasurable. When Mehmed claimed Radu as his companion, it was protection from other predators, but it also bound him in chains more invisible and permanent than any shackles. European chroniclers would later call Radu the Sultan's boy, mocking him as weak, corrupted, but Ottoman accounts used different words, more delicate, speaking of him as intimate companion, the language of chosen favorites. In truth, it was neither mockery nor romance. It was something darker, a grooming so subtle that the victim mistook it for affection. Mehmed wrote poetry for Radu, spoke to him gently, promised him honor and position, what Vlad experienced as violation. Radu was conditioned to interpret as love. The palace had succeeded in its most elegant cruelty. It had set the brothers on diverging tracks that would one day place them on opposite sides of battlefields. Vlad, the boy who hated submission, who memorized cruelty so he could return it. Radu, the boy who embraced submission, who learned to see it as a pathway to influence. And yet, beneath those choices, both were still children, both were still victims of a system that preyed on innocence and reshaped it into instruments. They passed each other sometimes in the corridors, close enough to touch, but they no longer spoke. Vlad saw Radu's silks and jewelry as betrayal. Radu saw Vlad's scars and burning eyes as futility. What neither could understand was that they were both walking through the same nightmare, only wearing different masks. The bond of blood was broken not by swords, but by the quiet mechanics of a palace that knew how to twist brothers into enemies, and that fracture, more than any battle, would define the rest of their lives. The news arrived in 1447 like a dagger in the dark. Vlad II Dracul, father of the two boys, had been murdered. He had tried to balance the impossible, swaying between loyalty to Hungary and obedience to the Ottoman Sultan. But such tightrope walking rarely ended in peace. Betrayed by his own boyars and abandoned by allies, his body was left in a ditch, a prince of Wallachia reduced to carrion for crows. When word reached the palace, the brothers received it in the only ways their different worlds had prepared them. Vlad, 16 now, taller and harder, received the news as confirmation of the truth he had already carved into his soul: trust is weakness. Loyalty is a death sentence, and mercy has no place in a world built on betrayal. He clenched his fists until his nails pierced skin and whispered to himself that the age of submission was over. Radu, just 13, reacted differently. His face paled, but instead of rage, he sought comfort where he had been taught to find it in Mehmed's presence. The young prince pressed his head against the Sultan's son's shoulder, accepting whispered promises that the empire would protect him, that the Ottoman family was now his true family. To Vlad, this was treason. To Radu, it was survival. The divide between them, once a crack, became an unbridgeable chasm. For Vlad, his father's murder meant that his entire childhood had been a lesson in futility. His family could not protect him, his homeland could not shield him, even blood could not guarantee safety. Only power could, and power, he had learned, was never given. It was taken. For Radu, the same event proved the opposite. His father's downfall was the failure of resistance, the cost of disobedience. Safety lay in surrender. By embracing the Ottomans fully, he gained not just protection, but status. He converted to Islam, took the name Radu Bey, and became not a hostage but an ally, a prince remade in the Sultan's image. The palace had achieved what it wanted all along. Two sons of Wallachia had been reshaped into mirror opposites, one who would one day return to his homeland breathing fire. Determined to build a kingdom of fear, the other who would stand at the Sultan's side, silk-clad and smiling, ready to tear down his brother's legacy on the battlefield. Yet, in the stillness of night, both boys carried the same wound. Both had been robbed of a father, of a homeland, of the right to grow into manhood unscarred. Both had been transformed by the same hand, but pain, like iron in the forge, bends differently depending on where the hammer falls. Vlad's hammer had struck in the direction of vengeance. Radu's bent toward dependence. One would make cruelty into a language, the other would mistake cruelty for care. The blood that once bound them had turned to betrayal, not because they wished it, but because the palace had taught them to see each other as enemies, and so, even before they would face each other in war. The battle between the brothers had already begun in silence, in glances, in the unspoken judgment each carried in his eyes. By the time Vlad reached his late adolescence, the palace had grown tired of him. He was no longer the beautiful child they had once tried to tame, nor the pliant youth who could be reshaped into a loyal servant. He had hardened, taller now, his voice beginning to crack with manhood, and with that change came danger. Resistance in a child could be molded, resistance in a young man had to be broken. So they turned to a method as old as empire itself. The guards prepared a wooden pole long, smoothed, and deceptively dull at its end. Vlad was held down, his body forced into position. The act was not improvisation, not crude brutality, but a procedure rehearsed many times before. The pole was guided with surgical precision, angled to avoid vital organs, designed to prolong agony rather than hasten death. It was not meant to kill him, it was meant to educate him. The lesson was simple: the body is not your own. Submission is survival. Resistance invites endless suffering. For 6 years, Vlad had endured the whispers, the music, the perfumed rooms, but this was different. This was the palace reducing him not merely to a hostage, but to an object, a warning, a living example of what defiance purchased. And yet, something happened the Ottomans did not expect. Vlad did not collapse into obedience. He memorized, he noted the angle, the slow intrusion, the way pain could be extended, suspended, engineered. He cataloged every detail: the diameter, the pressure, the way gravity did half the work. What had been meant to destroy him instead became the blueprint for his future. Years later, when Vlad Dracula ascended as voivode of Wallachia, he would summon carpenters and blacksmiths to perfect the very device that had once been used against him. He demanded calculations, measurements, variations. He rejected sharp tips because they killed too quickly. He ordered oil to coat the wood, not for preservation, but for smoothness. He remembered the friction, how it had felt worse than puncture. Every design choice was not invention, but recollection, a boy's torment re-engineered into an adult's obsession. This was the moment Vlad ceased to be merely a victim. The palace had given him more than scars. It had given him a template, it had handed him a weapon, and it had done so by mistake. The birth of the Impaler was not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, but in the silent horror of a chamber where a wooden pole taught a teenager that pain could be systematized, what the Ottomans thought was punishment. Vlad carried away as methodology. From then on, his vow sharpened. He would never again be powerless. He would never again be the one pinned beneath the weight of others. He would be the architect. He would be the one who measured the angle, who chose the stake, who decided the pace of agony. And in that vow, the boy who had been broken began to transform into the man who would terrify empires. The Impaler had been born, not in triumph, but in violation, and the world had yet to learn what that meant. While Vlad's rage hardened into steel, his younger brother Radu was being polished into silk. If Vlad was the wild horse that needed breaking, Radu was the songbird that needed only to be taught a sweeter tune. And the court of Sultan Murad and later his son Mehmed knew exactly how to cultivate him. Radu was 9 when they arrived in the palace, soft-featured, with hair that fell in golden waves and skin so pale that even chroniclers who despised him later could not avoid describing him in near-poetic terms. Where Vlad's jaw was sharp and angular, Radu's face was delicate. Where Vlad's eyes burned with suspicion, Radu's gaze reflected back warmth. It was not just beauty, it was pliability. The Ottomans recognized it instantly. While Vlad was sent to handlers who specialized in domination and punishment, Radu was guided toward another kind of education cultivation. He was dressed in silk so fine they seemed liquid in the torchlight, fed delicacies at the Sultan's table, and praised for his charm in multiple languages. At first, it seemed as though he had been spared the brutality his brother endured, but the truth was subtler, and in some ways, crueler. By the time Radu turned 11, he had caught the attention of Mehmed, the Sultan's young heir. Mehmed was only a few years older, but in the palace hierarchy that distance was vast. He was not just a boy, but a future god. When Mehmed claimed Radu as his favorite, it was a sentence wrapped in velvet. On one hand, it protected him. No guard would dare touch what belonged to the Sultan's son. On the other, it bound him in a gilded cage from which there was no escape. European chroniclers were blunt, sneeringly referring to him as Radu cel frumos Radu, the handsome and the Sultan's boy. Ottoman records, by contrast, cloaked the truth in euphemism, calling him Mehmed's muhibi, his intimate companion, the kind of term used for love as much as loyalty. Neither account was wholly wrong. Radu had been chosen, and to a child starving for security, chosen felt like love. Mehmed knew how to weave the illusion. He wrote poems for Radu in Arabic, delicate verses about roses and nightingales, comparing the boy's presence to spring after winter. He promised him power, whispered that one day, when he ruled, Radu would have a place beside him not as a hostage, but as family, to a child who had lost his father to betrayal. These words struck deep. And so Radu leaned in. Where Vlad resisted, Radu surrendered. Where Vlad hardened, Radu softened. He learned that beauty could be power, that affection could be wielded as effectively as a sword. It was not submission in the sense of brokenness. It was a different kind of survival through dependence. Psychologists centuries later would call it trauma bonding, the confusion of violation with care, the mistaking of intensity for intimacy. But to Radu, there was no language for it. There was only the warmth of Mehmed's attention, the safety of his protection, and the slow, poisonous belief that he mattered because he was wanted. The palace's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Two brothers had entered its gates together. One was forged into a weapon through pain, the other was bound into loyalty through pleasure. When they were released back into Wallachia, the Ottomans knew they would not return as allies, they would return as enemies. One brother would hate the empire too much to ever yield. The other would love it too much to ever betray. Already the distance between them was vast. When Vlad saw Radu's jeweled belts and silken sleeves, he saw only betrayal. When Radu looked at Vlad's scars and the fury burning in his eyes, he saw futility, a man chained to suffering, unable to adapt. The brothers, who had once whispered prayers together in the dark, now passed in corridors like strangers. The palace had succeeded. Blood was no longer enough to bind them. And history, centuries later, would remember them not as sons of the same father, but as mirror images split by the same hand, one destined to build forests of stakes, the other destined to stand beside the empire that had planted them. When Vlad finally left the Ottoman court and clawed his way back to Wallachia, he was no longer the boy who had arrived 6 years earlier. He was taller, harder, his eyes carrying the glassy distance of someone who had seen too much and never forgotten a moment of it. The Ottomans may have believed they had forged a servant, a broken hostage who would toe the line, but what they had actually released was something far more dangerous, a man who had memorized cruelty with the precision of a scholar, and who now sought to perfect it as a science. Once installed as voivode, Vlad summoned not poets, not priests, not scholars, but carpenters and blacksmiths. They came expecting to build fortifications or repair bridges. Instead, they found themselves standing in a makeshift workshop that looked less like a carpenter's hall and more like an anatomical theater. Wooden poles lined the walls, some carved to sharp points, others blunted, all awaiting his inspection. Vlad moved among them like a master architect, fingers tracing the wood grain, testing circumference, rejecting one, demanding adjustments on another. He spoke not of castles or armies, but of angles and durations. Too sharp, he told them, and death would come too quickly. Too blunt, and the body might reject the stake outright. The goal was not speed, the goal was endurance. Death must be slow enough for suffering to stretch into days, not hours. He ordered the wood to be soaked in oil, not only to preserve it but to ensure smoothness. Rough friction could tear too soon. Smoothness allowed the victim to slide gradually, nerve by nerve, inch by inch, prolonging the agony to its utmost. He remembered this from the palace, the false gentleness that had always preceded pain, the sickening sense of inevitability when the body betrayed itself. Now he recreated it, but from the position of master rather than victim. Criminals were brought as test subjects. Vlad observed the first impalements with the detachment of a scientist. He took notes aloud as if dictating to unseen scribes too steep. Adjust the base, reduce the taper. The prisoners screamed, writhed, cursed. Vlad's expression barely changed, if anything. His breathing became shallow, his eyes glassy, as though he was seeing two things at once, the present agony and the echo of his own. The craftsmen whispered among themselves, unnerved by their ruler's obsession. They had expected the capricious cruelty of a tyrant. What they saw instead was method, repetition, refinement. This was not sadism for its own sake. This was obsession elevated into design. Vlad was building more than tools. He was building a language of pain. Soon, the workshop filled with stakes of every variety. Thin ones for women and children, thick ones for warriors, medium-sized ones for priests and merchants. The angle of entry was always exact, modeled after something only Vlad fully understood. He insisted that every stake must follow the same trajectory, the same slow violation he had memorized night after night in the Sultan's palace. And then he expanded the project beyond the wood itself. Blacksmiths were ordered to forge metal caps for the stakes, preventing splitting during prolonged use. Oil merchants were commanded to supply gallons of the precise viscosity Vlad demanded. An entire micro-economy grew around his obsession, where most princes built fortresses of stone. Vlad was constructing an industry of agony. But the most disturbing element was his insistence on arrangement. The stakes were not merely execution tools, they were symbols, placed in patterns that conveyed messages, circular arrays to suggest entrapment, triangular groupings to evoke the Holy Trinity, desecrated by screams, Sometimes he arranged bodies to spell out words in Arabic words Mehmed himself would recognize, what others saw as chaos. Vlad intended as a message written in flesh. Every scream, every corpse, every stake was autobiography. Each one whispered the same declaration: I am no longer the one impaled. I am the one who impales. And for those who witnessed these displays, there could be no mistake. This was not the cruelty of a barbarian prince. This was the precision of a man who had once been broken and who now used that memory as a template to break others. The weapon the Ottomans thought they had forged in Vlad was not loyalty, nor obedience. It was something they had never anticipated, a mirror sharper than steel, reflecting back every cruelty they had inflicted, magnified 1,000-fold. The boy who had once been powerless now stood as voivode of Wallachia, and in his hands, memory itself had become a weapon. By the late 1450s, Wallachia had become a land ruled not only by sword and tax, but by spectacle. Trials were no longer simply about crime and punishment. Under Vlad, they became rituals in which the accused were forced to act out fragments of his own buried past. His justice was not the balance of scales, but the projection of wounds. One day, a woman stood trembling before his throne in Targoviste. She was accused of adultery, her husband a merchant who had denounced her after hearing rumors of her affair with a traveling blacksmith. In almost any other European court, the punishment might have been public shame, a fine, or at worst, banishment. But this was not any other court. This was the court of Vlad Dracula, and her fate would be decided not by her guilt, but by the shadows stirring behind his eyes. You broke sacred bonds, Vlad declared, his voice low but carrying. His counselors shifted uneasily. They had heard that tone before, a tone that meant the prince was no longer speaking to the accused alone, but to phantoms only he could see. The woman sobbed, pleading for mercy. She spoke of her husband's coldness, her loneliness, of the warmth the blacksmith had shown her. But Vlad's face remained stone. In her betrayal, he heard echoes of other words: the palace guards who told him submission was honor, who whispered that degradation was a gift. He remembered how they had spoken of sacred duty while breaking his body. Her sin was not her own, it was his, reflected back to him in unbearable clarity. Bring the special stake, Vlad ordered. The guards froze. They knew exactly which one he meant. Within the arsenal of his cruelty, Vlad kept a subset of devices reserved for women accused of sexual crimes. These were not ordinary stakes. They were thinner, sharper, sometimes heated until they glowed red. To outsiders, this might seem an invention of sadism. To those who understood Vlad's psychology, it was different. These instruments were not simply punishments, but reenactments. When the heated stake was brought forward, Vlad rose from his throne. The body must be purified, he intoned, sealed by fire as it is opened by wood. His words trembled with something close to fervor. The woman screamed, struggling, but Vlad did not hear her. He was listening to other screams, the ones from his own childhood that never left him. The court watched in horror as the sentence was carried out. The red-hot stake pierced, cauterizing as it violated, sealing flesh even as it destroyed it. The woman's shrieks echoed through the hall, not just as punishment for her betrayal, but as an exorcism of Vlad's memory. He studied her agony with rapt attention, as though waiting to see in her face the reflection of his own once-broken spirit. For Vlad, this was justice, not the justice of laws or customs, but of memory avenged. Each crime judged in his court was weighed not against statute, but against his scars. A thief reminded him of his own stolen childhood. A liar echoed the palace tutors who smiled as they twisted truth into submission. And adulteresses, they were the clearest of all, for they embodied the corruption of trust, the betrayal of sacred bonds. To his boyars, it was terrifyingly clear Wallachia's ruler was not trying criminals, he was trying himself. Again and again, through the bodies of others, every punishment was a projection, every sentence an echo. The line between justice and therapy, between law and vengeance, had dissolved. The woman's body fell silent at last, the smell of scorched flesh filling the hall. Vlad's counselors bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in fear. They understood that they were watching not a ruler deliver justice, but a haunted child restage his own torment under the guise of law. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable in Wallachia. No one would ever stand trial alone. Every accused carried into the courtroom a second. invisible defendant the broken boy Vlad still carried within him. The chamber was heavy with silence after the woman's screams died away. Her body slumped upon the stake, her flesh seared by fire. Courtiers dared not lift their eyes to their voivode. Some crossed themselves, others stood rigid, terrified that the prince's gaze might fall upon them next. Vlad remained motionless, staring at the charred body as though searching for something within it, an answer to a question only he knew how to ask. Then it happened. The woman, though broken, still clung to a shred of breath. Her lips moved, her eyes finding Vlad's with a clarity that cut through the haze of pain. With her last words, she spat a truth so sharp it pierced deeper than any weapon. "You are not punishing me for what I did," she gasped. "You are punishing me for what was done to you." The hall froze. The guards stiffened. The boyars looked at each other in disbelief, their faces pale. The woman's voice, hoarse and trembling, had spoken aloud the thing that no one in Wallachia dared to say. For a fleeting moment, Vlad was not the impaler, not the voivode, but a boy again, a boy whose body had once been seized, whose will had been crushed, whose innocence had been stolen in marble chambers far away. His mask slipped, his jaw clenched, his face turned ashen, then flushed crimson. The silence in the hall was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of torches. The counselors shifted nervously, realizing they had glimpsed something forbidden, the vulnerable wound beneath the armor of cruelty. For a heartbeat, Vlad seemed to falter. The mask of authority flickered, and behind it lay a child's terror, raw and unhealed. Then, as though seized by fury at his own weakness, his voice cracked like a whip. "Make it last a week," he ordered. The guards hesitated. Even they, seasoned in their master's horrors, were startled. A week was unthinkable, but Vlad's command was iron, and no man in that chamber dared defy him. They carried her away, her body still twitching, her face still fixed on Vlad with the dreadful clarity of someone who had seen him for who he truly was. The boyars whispered of it afterward in terrified secrecy. Some said they saw Vlad's hands tremble as he gave the order. Others swore they glimpsed tears that he quickly swallowed back with rage. All agreed that the woman had struck at the very heart of him, naming aloud what he himself could never admit, that his cruelties were not the will of God, not justice, not even vengeance against others, but a desperate attempt to silence the echoes of his own torment. And this realization, far from breaking him, drove him deeper into obsession. If one dying woman could pierce his armor with a single sentence, then how much more could his enemies see? What did Radu see? When he looked at him, what did Mehmed, the Sultan, see when reports of impalements reached Constantinople? The thought haunted him, gnawed at him. He became more ruthless, more inventive, as if layering new horrors upon old scars could bury the truth deeper. The woman's words followed him like a specter. "You are not punishing me for what I did. You are punishing me for what was done to you." From that day forward, cruelty was no longer just Vlad's weapon. It became his disguise, his shield against recognition. Each new act of terror was not merely punishment for crimes, it was an attempt to drown out the unbearable possibility that his enemies might see through him as clearly as that dying adulteress had. And so, to silence a truth too dangerous to face, Vlad redoubled his horrors. The mask hardened, the cruelties deepened, and the boy who had once trembled in marble corridors vanished further behind the blood-soaked figure of the impaler. It was Easter Sunday, 1459. In most of Christendom, bells rang, incense curled through chapels, and choirs sang of resurrection. In Wallachia, however, Vlad Dracula marked the holy day with a different kind of ritual, one born not of faith, but of memory twisted into spectacle. In the fields outside Târgoviște, a forest of stakes rose like grotesque trees in springtime. Upon them writhed men and women, soldiers and merchants, nobles and peasants, all condemned for crimes real or imagined. Their bodies swayed in the wind, moans weaving together into a chorus of agony. At the center of this garden of death stood a long table set with silver plates and crystal goblets, gleaming as if for a royal banquet. Vlad had ordered it placed close enough that he could reach out and brush his hand against a victim's leg if he wished. "Closer," he commanded, gesturing to one particular stake where a merchant's son still struggled, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who knew death but had not yet met it. Servants obeyed, dragging the table forward until Vlad could watch the man's face as he ate. The feast was not about food. The roasted lamb, the spiced wine, the sugared almonds were secondary. The true menu was pain, and Vlad dined on it as devoutly as any believer on holy bread. He raised his goblet and toasted the writhing bodies as if they were honored guests. Some were arranged in outer rings captured Turks whose death sent a message to Constantinople. Others were closer, boyars who had betrayed him or whispered rebellion, and nearest of all were those whose crimes had touched Vlad personally, each stake a private vengeance turned into public theater. The moans of the dying became a liturgy, where other courts sang hymns. Vlad presided over a mass of suffering. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring the rhythm of gasps and screams as if they were music. His nobles sat stiffly at the table, their faces pale, forcing morsels into their mouths while staring at the ground. They knew better than to break the silence. For Vlad, this ritual was more than cruelty, it was inversion in the Ottoman palace. He had once been forced to lie helpless while others took pleasure at his expense. Feasting had happened above him, while he was silenced below. Now the roles were reversed. He ate while others writhed, his appetite growing stronger with every spasm. It was communion in reverse, not Christ giving his body for mankind, but mankind giving their bodies for Vlad's resurrection. Those who observed him closely reported a strange transformation during these feasts. The tense, paranoid prince seemed almost serene. His usual bursts of rage vanished, replaced by a calm intensity. He would lean back in his chair, wine in hand, and smile faintly as if at peace. For a brief time. The boy inside him was quiet, lulled into silence by the spectacle outside. And then came the ambassador. Among the writhing figures was an Ottoman envoy, condemned for refusing to remove his turban in Vlad's presence, unlike most victims. His voice had not yet broken. He muttered words between spasms of agony, his throat still strong enough to form syllables. Vlad silenced the feast with a gesture. The words were Arabic, a prayer, not just any prayer, but one Vlad remembered from the palace. It was the chant they had spoken over him during certain ceremonies, telling him it sanctified what was happening, that his humiliation was holy. The ambassador's prayer carried him back instantly to marble halls, to perfumed rooms, to music-masking violation. The goblet shattered in his hand. Wine and blood mixed on the tablecloth, and the serene mask of the voivode cracked. He rose from his chair, trembling with fury. "Remove him!" he ordered. The guards obeyed. But Vlad's command was not mercy. He demanded the envoy's wounds be treated, his life prolonged. Then he ordered him re-impaled at a different angle, one that would allow him to continue speaking, gasping, praying for days. "Sing for me," Vlad whispered in Turkish, leaning close. "Sing the songs from the palace, all of them." For 3 days, Vlad feasted beneath that stake, forcing the envoy to recreate the soundtrack of his childhood torment. Each prayer, each hymn, each whispered verse was dragged out of the man's ruined throat and twisted into accompaniment for Vlad's meal. Every note carried memory, and every memory demanded more victims to drown it. To his nobles, the message was unmistakable. Their prince's cruelty was not chaos, but liturgy. The banquet was not about food, it was about ritual, about taking back what had once been stolen, transforming humiliation into mastery. On that Easter Sunday, resurrection did not belong to Christ, it belonged to Vlad the Impaler. By the summer of 1462, the roads into Wallachia no longer smelled of earth or pine. Travelers spoke of another stench sweet, cloying, heavy that clung to their clothes and hair for days. It was the smell of rot, and it came from a spectacle so vast that even hardened soldiers reeled. Vlad Dracula had turned an entire landscape into a monument of terror, the forest of the impaled. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of wooden stakes stretching as far as the eye could see, their sharpened tips driven through bellies, chests, and mouths, Turks captured in raids, boyars accused of treachery, peasants suspected of theft. No distinction was made. Men, women, even children hung upon the stakes like grotesque fruit. Some swayed lifelessly, their skin already gray, others still writhed, their twitching hands clawing at the air, their cries drifting on the wind like the wailing of lost souls. The scale was overwhelming. Chroniclers from neighboring lands claimed there were 20,000 impaled. The number may have been smaller or perhaps greater, But the truth hardly mattered. What mattered was the effect. From a distance, the rows of bodies looked like a forest in midsummer, each victim a ghastly blossom crowning the wooden stems. Birds circled overhead, wolves and wild dogs prowled the edges, snapping at the blood that dripped into the grass. When the Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia with his massive army, he expected battle. What he found was silence, no armies, no drums, no banners, only this garden of horror. His men faltered, the bravest of janissaries, warriors who had stormed Constantinople itself, gagged and crossed themselves. Some fell to their knees, believing they had stumbled into the very pit of hell. Mehmed himself, who had known Vlad as a boy, spurred his horse forward and stared at the spectacle. His face revealed nothing, but inside he must have remembered. He must have seen the pale, trembling boy in the palace, the one who had once lain beneath others' pleasure, now transformed into a monster who could terrify even an empire. A chronicler claimed the Sultan whispered, "This man cannot be overcome by force. He is too cruel for hell itself." Whether or not those were his exact words, the army felt them, morale fractured. To fight Vlad meant not merely to risk death, but to risk ending upon a stake. Your body left as food for crows, your soul abandoned in a field of the damned. For Vlad, this forest was not only a weapon of war, it was a mirror. Each stake was a reflection of his past, each writhing body an echo of his own childhood torment. By multiplying the horror, he blurred the memory of his own suffering in a sea of pain. His pain was harder to find. The boy disappeared behind 20,000 corpses, and the man stood revealed not a victim, but the architect of terror. Yet witnesses swore there were moments, rare and fleeting, when Vlad would walk alone among the stakes at night, torches burned low, and the cries of the dying softened into a grim lullaby. He would move slowly, almost reverently, touching the wood, listening to the gasps. Sometimes he lingered before the stake of a young boy or girl, staring into their terrified eyes. And in those moments, some said, he looked not like a prince or a monster, but like a man staring into a mirror he could not escape. The forest of the impaled achieved its purpose. Mehmed withdrew, his campaign broken not by swords, but by fear. Vlad had defended his land, but at a terrible cost. He had planted his legacy in blood-soaked soil, and it would never die. To his enemies, the forest was a nightmare. To his people, it was proof of their voivode's ferocity. To Vlad himself, it was both shield and confession, a public monument to the horrors he had suffered, disguised as the horrors he inflicted. And as the stakes rotted and fell, as bodies collapsed into the earth, the legend remained. Vlad the Impaler was no longer just a ruler of Wallachia. He had become a figure of myth, a man who turned his trauma into a forest, and his forest into a warning to the world. Victory was fleeting. Though Vlad had driven back the Sultan's might with terror, the walls of his own house began to crack. Wallachia was not a kingdom united, but a land forever trembling between empires, forever gnawed by intrigue, and in the whispers of courtiers, the seeds of betrayal grew. Among the boyars, those same nobles who once watched him dine among the impaled, resentment burned. They had bent their heads, feigned loyalty, eaten at his table, but their hatred only deepened. Each stake driven into the earth was also driven into their pride. They had lost sons, cousins, and allies to Vlad's wrath, and though they feared him, fear and hatred are brothers that never live apart for long. And then there was his brother, Radu the Handsome. Once a boy hostage beside him in the Sultan's palace, had chosen a different path, where Vlad returned scarred. Radu returned softened. The Ottomans had seduced him not with chains, but with silk. They gave him luxury, affection, and eventually, power. Radu embraced their ways, their faith, their armies. He became not a prisoner, but a favorite, and from favorite, a weapon. It was Radu who led the campaign against his brother, bringing Turkish armies not as invaders but as liberators. To the boyars, weary of Vlad's cruelty, Radu promised leniency. To the peasants, starved by war, he promised peace. Where Vlad ruled through terror, Radu offered comfort, and in a land exhausted by blood, comfort often speaks louder than fear. When the Ottoman banners rose again along the Danube, many Wallachians opened their gates. Betrayal spread like wildfire. Vlad, who had stood unbroken against the Sultan himself, found his own people slipping through his fingers. Allies melted away, nobles defected, soldiers abandoned their posts, even the peasants, who once saw him as protector, turned their eyes from his cause. It was not a battle lost on the field but in the heart. Vlad fled northward, his retinue dwindling, the forest of impaled corpses behind him now nothing more than a memory. His brother claimed the throne. In Hungary, Vlad sought refuge with King Matthias Corvinus. He expected asylum, perhaps even support, for had he not stood as a bulwark against the Ottomans, had he not defended Christendom with blood and steel, but Matthias was a king. And kings weighed politics more heavily than gratitude. Rumors had spread, some whispered by boyars, others perhaps crafted by Radu himself, that Vlad was not a defender of Christendom but a monster, a tyrant unfit for alliance. Matthias smiled, welcomed Vlad into his halls, and then placed him in chains. For more than a decade, Vlad lingered in captivity. Behind walls and bars, the Impaler who once commanded thousands became a prisoner. Once more a man returned to the role that had first shaped him. Some say he was treated with honor, others that he was kept in filth. Whatever the truth, captivity gnawed at him, reawakening memories of his childhood imprisonment. But even in chains, Vlad remained Vlad. Guards whispered that he trapped birds and mice in his cell, impaling them on splinters of wood, arranging their tiny bodies as he once had arranged thousands. The forest had shrunk, but the ritual remained. Terror was not just his weapon, it was his language, his prayer, his way of remembering who he was. And through it all, he dreamed, not of peace, not of forgiveness, but of return. One day, he swore, the boyars who betrayed him, the brother who supplanted him, the peasants who turned away, they would once again feel the weight of his vengeance. His forest would grow again. And when the chance finally came, Vlad seized it with both hands. The years in captivity had not dulled him, if anything. They sharpened him, the way a blade grows keener with each stroke of the whetstone. When King Matthias finally released Vlad in the mid-1470s, it was not out of pity, but necessity. The Ottomans still pressed into Europe, their shadow stretching wider with each campaign. Wallachia, perched like a dagger between empires, could not be left in the hands of a pliant brother. Radu was dead now, claimed by illness, and the throne of Wallachia lay unsteady once again. For the boyars and peasants alike, Vlad's name was no longer just a memory, it was a rumor, a chill carried on the wind. They whispered that the Impaler would return, that he would ride again with his black horse and his iron will. Some spoke with fear, some with hope, but all with certainty. And then he did. In 1476, Vlad Dracula rode back into Wallachia. The years had carved lines into his face, streaked his hair with gray, but the fire in his eyes remained. He was no longer just a prince, he was a revenant, a ghost walking in daylight. To his followers, his return felt like divine justice, the resurrection of a ruler who had terrified the greatest empire on earth. To his enemies, it was the reopening of a nightmare thought long buried. This time, though, his power was fragile. He no longer commanded endless armies or endless fear. His throne rested on promises from Hungarian allies and the loyalty of a people grown weary of war. Wallachia was exhausted, drained by decades of conflict. Its fields lay scorched, its villages hollowed. Terror alone could not hold it together anymore. But Vlad did not change. He could not change. He returned to his old methods with the same fervor, as if the years in captivity had been only a pause, not a lesson. Traitors were punished with stakes, thieves with mutilation, and enemies with the same theater of cruelty that had once broken the Sultan's resolve. And yet, there was something different in him now, a shadow of desperation. It was as if he knew his time was short, that this return was not a new beginning but a final act. Witnesses described him as restless, almost feverish, moving from campaign to campaign with little regard for consequence. He drove his men hard, punished them harder, and seemed to hear the echo of betrayal in every whisper. Still, for a brief moment, he reclaimed what was his. The dragon's son once more sat upon the throne of Wallachia, not as a pawn of empires but as a prince who had carved his rule from blood. He was no longer the child who had suffered in silence, he was the man who had remade silence into screams. But the world had changed. The Ottomans were stronger, the Hungarians more cautious, and Wallachia more fragile than ever. Vlad's reign, his third and final reign, would not last long. The Impaler had returned, but the forest he planted this time would not grow wide. Instead, his legacy itself would become the forest, rooted not in soil but in memory. And fate, as always, was already closing in. The winter of 1476 crept across the valleys of Wallachia like a shroud. The rivers slowed, the forests grew brittle, and the villages huddled closer to their fires. For Vlad Dracula, it was the season of reckoning. He had returned to his throne, but his crown was a fragile one, balanced not on the loyalty of his people but on the tip of a spear. The Ottomans loomed in the south, their armies disciplined and vast, while Hungarian allies grew weary of supporting a prince who brought terror as much to friend as to foe. Still, Vlad could not bend. He prepared as he always had, with fire and fear. Scouts were dispatched into the forests, villages along the border were emptied, their homes reduced to ash so no enemy could take shelter. Prisoners of war, as ever, found themselves impaled, their bodies raised like black flags against the horizon, a warning carved into flesh. It was his last performance, a theater of cruelty meant to hold back the tide. But the tide no longer feared him. The battle came quickly, brutal in its brevity. The Ottomans pressed into Wallachia once more, and Vlad, with only a thin force at his back, met them head-on. There were no forests of stakes this time, no great ambushes to tilt the field, only steel against steel in the snow-choked woods near Bucharest. The clash was fierce. Chroniclers tell us that Vlad fought like a man possessed, his blade moving with the rage of all the years he had lost. He cut through soldiers as if the ghosts of the impaled fought beside him. He refused retreat, refused surrender, as though he would rather die in the mud than live in chains again. And then it happened. Some say it was an Ottoman blade that struck him down, others whisper it was treachery, that his own men, weary of terror, betrayed him in the chaos of battle. No one can say for certain. What is known is this: Vlad Dracula fell, his body broken on the field he had chosen, his blood soaking into the frozen earth of his homeland. But death did not bring peace. The Ottomans, it is said, severed his head and carried it across the Danube, presenting it to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople. The Sultan, who had once quaked at the forests of stakes, now stared at the severed head of the Impaler. Some accounts claim Mehmed smiled in satisfaction. Others say he stared in silence, as if seeing the end of an era, not just the death of a prince, but the extinguishing of a terror that had once bent empires. Back in Wallachia, his body vanished, buried, perhaps, in a monastery, or perhaps left unmarked, lost to time. His grave has never been found, his bones never confirmed. The land that had fed his cruelty seemed to swallow him whole, as if refusing to give the world even the satisfaction of a corpse. The Impaler was gone, but his shadow remained. And as the snow settled over the fields, those who had fought and those who had feared him alike knew one thing: Vlad Dracula had left behind more than a throne. He had left a legend that would outlive kings, empires, and even truth itself. When Vlad Dracula's severed head was paraded before the Ottoman Sultan, it might have seemed like the end of his story, a cruel tyrant cut down, his reign extinguished. But in truth, that was only the beginning. Because men like Vlad do not stay buried. In the monasteries of Wallachia, whispers began to circulate. Some monks wrote that his cruelty had been punishment for sin, a divine scourge sent to cleanse the land. Others dared to claim he had been a protector, a wall of fire that had stood between Christendom and the crescent moon of Islam. To the peasants, he was both demon and savior. They told stories by the fire of his merciless punishments, of thieves boiled alive, of adulterers flayed, but also of his unbending justice, of a cup of gold left in the marketplace untouched because none dared steal under his watch. The chronicles of his enemies preserved his name with equal fascination. Saxon merchants in Transylvania printed lurid pamphlets of his atrocities, spreading tales of rivers choked with corpses, of feasts among the impaled. These were sold not just in Hungary and Germany but across Europe, becoming one of the earliest forms of mass propaganda. And as each tale spread, Vlad grew less man and more myth. To some, he was a monster who drank the blood of his victims. To others, he was a hero who had stood alone against the Ottomans. What no one could deny was this: his shadow grew larger in death than it ever had in life. By the 16th century, His name had already fused with whispers of the supernatural. Dracula, son of the dragon, or son of the devil, became a word loaded with dread. In the dark forests of the Carpathians, peasants swore they had seen him return. Riding through the night on a black horse, his eyes burning like coals, they claimed he could not truly die, that his cruelty had granted him a second life, one fed on blood and fear. Centuries later, when Bram Stoker searched for a name to give his fictional vampire count, it was Vlad Dracula he found, a name already heavy with legend, already stained with both terror and fascination, a name that seemed destined to survive. And so, the cruel prince of Wallachia, who impaled his enemies and burned his own land, was reborn in the imagination of the world. He had lived as a man of flesh and blood, but in death he became something far more enduring, a symbol, a myth, a vampire lord who would haunt not just his enemies but the entire world's dreams. What had begun as a life of war and cruelty ended as a legend too vast to contain, and even now, more than 5 centuries later, when we speak of Dracula, it is not the prince's bones we remember, it is the fear he planted, the stories he inspired, and the shadow he still casts across history. The man was gone, the monster would never die. In the end, the fires of war burned out, kingdoms rose and fell, and the wooden stakes rotted away in the forests of Wallachia. But Vlad Dracula's story refused to die. It lingered in whispers, in pamphlets, in prayers uttered in fear, until it passed beyond the limits of history and entered the realm of legend. Every empire that once knew his name is long gone, yet his shadow remains. To Romanians, he is still remembered as a defender, a figure of national pride who stood alone against overwhelming odds. To others, he is remembered as a sadist who transformed cruelty into art. And to the rest of the world, he became something darker, something immortal, the seed of the vampire myth that would grow into one of the most enduring stories humanity has ever told. The transformation is almost poetic. A man who drained his land of life so that none could defy him became the eternal bloodsucker of fiction. A prince who lived by fear became an immortal count who lives forever in nightmares. His cruelty was so extreme that history itself could not contain it. It spilled over into myth, into theater, into novels, and into film, shaping the very way we imagine evil. When you hear the word Dracula today, perhaps you think of castles shrouded in mist, bats swarming beneath a moonlit sky, or a pale figure with blood on his lips. But behind that mask, behind the fantasy, there was once a man who lived in the dark crucible of the 15th century, where survival demanded brutality and where cruelty itself became a weapon of rule. History may argue forever whether Vlad Dracula was a monster or a hero, but perhaps that is the truth of his legacy. He was both. He embodied the best and worst of human nature, unbending courage, absolute cruelty, desperate defiance, and endless hunger for power. And so, 5 centuries later, when we speak his name, we do not just remember the blood he spilled, we remember the strange truth that even death could not silence him. Vlad Dracula, the Impaler, prince, tyrant, defender, monster, the man who became a myth and the myth that still refuses to die.